The border between Kenya and Somalia has evolved a lot. In this video, I'm going to look at several treaties that shaped that border very much. And the treaties I'm reading are, of course, in the book, The Treaties on the Lands of the Somali, a book that you can get on Amazon, and you can check the pinned comment or the description box if you are watching on YouTube. And if you are watching on TikTok, check my profile, get a link there. Now, this book has many close to 44, 45 treaties that have been provided or are there. You can read for yourself. As I'm reading this book, something interesting is emerging, and on many issues of things very interesting are emerging. But on the border between Kenya and Somalia, I'm finding out things that I've not known. Part of this, or one of these, or two, I think, or three of these treaties mention how the Benadir ports, or the Benadir coast, of course, it was called the Benadir, and that included from Mogadishu, Kismayu, Merka, Barawa, those port cities together, they were known as the Benadir. And there was a transfer of ownership of those ports in the 19th century, especially the late 19th century, in a way that is can be a little bit confusing. And here is why. The earliest identified owner in these treaties is the Sultan of Zanzibar. I've discussed this in other videos, and the relationship that the Sultan of Zanzibar had with the Benadir ports is a very interesting one. It seems like he did not have, we could say, authority. He most likely had influence, and those are two different things. And he had influence because, of course, he was a Muslim leader. He was a sultanate, and most of the Benadir ports were also under sultanates, and they were also Muslim sultanates, of course. And there was this sense of brotherhood between the Sultanate of Zanzibar and the sultanates in the coast of Somalia. And I think the Sultan of Zanzibar came to kind of like take advantage of that, specifically because Zanzibar became like the center of the east coast of Africa. Like international ambassadors and people would come to Zanzibar. It was easier to come to Zanzibar. Of course, Zanzibar had a very long history with especially Britain, and I've said this in another video that the splitting of Zanzibar from the Oman Sultanate was actually work of the British. Very interesting. And now, the British gave Zanzibar some level of prominence in the East Coast. And most of the other European powers coming to the East Coast would go to Zanzibar first. And Zanzibar provided very conducive environment to stay in, and of course, infrastructure and services and all that. And so Zanzibar got this prominence over the rest of the Commonwealth in the Eastern Africa region. Now, because of that, the Sultan of Zanzibar, because he had influence over the coast of the Somali coast, he came to use that, and he sold that to the Europeans that I have authority. So it went from influence to authority. When you read these treaties, you realize there are several of these treaties where Zanzibar, the Sultan of Zanzibar, is negotiating with different Europeans about the East Coast, especially the Somali coast. Seems like, and I've read, there is a treaty, for example, that was signed on the 3rd of August 1889 between British East Africa Company and Italy. Very interesting. In this treaty, the British East Africa Company seems to claim that it had ownership of the Benadir ports. Now, this is very new information, that because I've never thought that the British East Africa Company did ever own or claim, not really own, claim to have ownership of those ports. But this treaty seems to make that claim. And it seems like the British East Africa Company acquired those rights from the Sultan of Zanzibar. And after getting those rights, in 1889, the British East Africa Company decided to sell some of those rights to the Italians. The Italians are taking over Kismayu, Brava, Marka, Mogadishu, and Warshaik. Those are the ports that were being transferred from the British East Africa Company to the Italians. On 24th March 1891, there was another treaty. Now, this one was signed between the British government and the Italian government about the border between, of course, the Italian Somaliland and the British, of course, East Africa Protectorate, that is Kenya today, where the border was going to be. And when you read this, it's very interesting that up to Kismayu, actually, was part of the East Africa Protectorate. According to this agreement, that's how they drew the map, that Kismayu was going to be part of the East Africa Protectorate. And of course, some parts of the Juba region, that area was basically, because this is what it says, the demarcation in the East Africa between the spheres of influence respectively reserved to Great Britain and Italy shall follow from the sea mid-channel thalweg of the River Juba up to latitude 6 north, Kismayu with its territory on the right bank of the river, thus remaining to England. Now, up to Kismayu was remained to be part of the East Africa Protectorate. Now, that is a treaty that was signed on the 24th March 1891. Now, then there was another treaty that was signed 13th January 1905. Now, this is a very interesting treaty, because this treaty basically was an agreement between the Italians and the British about the Italians leasing, not buying, leasing some land around Kismayu from the British. And they were going to be paying some amount, I think annually, to the British government. The Italians were going to pay some amounts to the British government every year. So at this point, this is 1905, Kismayu is still part of the East Africa Protectorate, at least according to the arrangements, treaty arrangements that were in place at that point. Now, then there was now a comprehensive treaty that was done in 1924. Now, this is the treaty that actually changed significantly the border between the East Africa Protectorate and Italian Somaliland, and actually brought the border to where we could say it is today. Maybe there are a few things that changed after that a little bit, but that the border that exists today between Somalia and Kenya, we could say was more or less settled in 1924 through this treaty that was signed on the 15th July of that year. And the parties were United Kingdom and Italy, of course. And this treaty, it's titled the Treaty Between the United Kingdom and Italy Regulating Certain Questions Concerning the Boundaries of Their Respective Territories in East Africa. Now, Article 1, it says, His Britannic Majesty, in his own name and on his own behalf, and by virtue of his protectorate over Zanzibar, in the name and on behalf of His Highness the Sultan of Zanzibar, so far as the latter may be concerned, transfers to His Majesty the King of Italy all sovereign rights and title over the portions of African territory lying between the present Italian colony of southern Somaliland and a new borderline to be determined as follows. From the confluence of rivers Ganale and Daua along the coast of the Daua upstream to the southern point of small southerly bend of the latter river in the vicinity of Malkare. Thence in southern westerly direction in straight line to the center of Pool of Dumasa. Thence in southern westerly direction, line towards Eila Kala, which remains in British territory, to such meridian East Greenwich as shall live in Italian colony, the well of El Beru, thence along the same meridian southwards, and now describes in detail where that line was going to be. And then Article 2, the above boundary is shown on the attached map, and all reference in the above description of boundary are to this map. In the event of differences between the text and the map, the text will prevail. And then there is an article that discusses what happens to the people who are living northern part before the new line was drawn, what was going to happen to them. And it seems like they were told that if they chose, they could become subjects of the Italians, if they chose. And there was a period that was given for them to make that decision. If for those who did not want to be under the Italians, they had the option of actually moving to the south and then continuing becoming the subjects of the British. I don't know whether that happened or how many people moved, how many Somalis actually moved from the Italian Somaliland to join the East Africa Protectorate, what came to be known as the Northern Frontier District. I don't know how many people moved, but there was that option. There was also an understanding between the British and the Italians that the ownership of land of those people who were already there were going to be respected. That is Article 7 of that agreement. If they wanted to move, then they would be allowed to sell, maybe probably using the market price and then move. But if they wanted to stay, they will stay and still own those properties. This is a very long treaty, actually. And if you want, you can get the book and read it yourself. But it's a treaty that's very interesting. But the summary of it is that this is the treaty that actually shaped the border we have today between Kenya and Somalia. Of course, then there was no Kenya, there was no Somalia. What was there then, of course, was Italian Somaliland, and then there was the East Africa Protectorate. By then, I think in 1924, it had started being called Kenya. So this is the treaty that actually changed a lot of that. Of course, there is history that happened later. Of course, towards independence, there were these expectations, especially from among the Somalis, that now that colonization was coming to an end, they were expecting that they would bring together all the lands of the Somalis to form one nation, of course, one state, that is. And seemed like that was going to happen. Ogaden, it seems like at some point the British were like, yeah, Ogaden should join the rest of the Somalis. And then there was, of course, British Somaliland, which was very willing and ready to do that. Italian Somaliland was very ready and willing to do that. Djibouti, there was a referendum and there are things that happened there. He did not join that coalition or that grouping. The Northern Frontier District, there was also expectation from Somalia, of course, and also by the Somalis themselves in Kenya, or the Northern Frontier District, that they were going to join that. But that's history that we've covered in another video, going through other documents and what happened in the 1963, 1964, around there, and from 1960 actually. So that happened. But in this video, I was just looking at the changing of the border between what we know today as Kenya and what is known as today as Somali. And this is a border that has changed significantly. As you can see that by 19 or something, the border was up beyond Kismayu. Kismayu was in the East Africa Protectorate, and then it changed, and then it came to where it is today. Those are my random thoughts.